Hello and welcome to this Heroes of Blackreach tutorial all about firing. So this is the second tutorial about firing. If you haven't seen the first one, then I'd recommend going and checking out Firing Part 1. So one of the main things that we're going to be looking at in this tutorial is alternate firing actions. So what is an alternate firing action? So typically when you're firing a unit in Heroes of Blackreach, you'll use these values here. So these are used when you perform a normal firing action. However, some units have the ability to perform alternate firing actions instead. So here we can see an icon that shows that this unit has an alternate firing action. And in this case it's an indirect fire action, which makes sense because this is an artillery unit. So here are some examples of alternate firing actions. So we have Flamethrower, Howitzer, Indirect Fire, Grenades, Sniper, Psychic Powers. And in this tutorial I'm going to be looking first at these four types of alternate firing actions. And what connects these together is that they're all template firing actions. So all of these make use of templates that you place down on the battle grid. And I'll go through each one of these in turn and show you how it works. So we'll start off with the Flamethrower. So there are three different sizes of Flamethrower, and there are three different symbols that are used to denote which size of template you're supposed to use for the particular unit. So first we have the F template. So to the left of the letter F you can see the icon that will appear on the unit, and on the right hand side you can see the template that you're going to place down on the battle grid. So the next size is M. Again, the icon is on the left and the template on the right. So you can see this as a larger template. And then the final one is the H template, which is even larger still, and it has that red icon with the H on it. So now we've seen the different types of flamethrowers, let's have a look at an example of how they can be used. So we have the battle grid, and to the battle grid we've added a flamer unit, and I've added some orcs that we're going to be targeting with the flamer. So the first thing to note is this flamer unit makes use of the M template, so that's the medium flamer template. And next we're going to place that flamer template down onto the battle grid. So when you're placing the template, you need to orient the template from the center of the unit that's using the template. So here you can see that I've pivoted the template over to the left, and I've targeted those three units of orcs. And every unit that lies underneath that template is considered to have been hit by that template. And in this case, all three units of orcs are just underneath that template, and so they're considered to be affected by that template. So the next thing to look at is the combat values that are printed on the template, and we use those in preference to the combat values that are printed on the unit. So whenever we're using a template weapon, always look for the combat values that are printed on the template. So we can see that the template provides a +4 combat value against those infantry units. So going through each unit in turn that's underneath the template, we're going to resolve the firing action. So we'll start off with this sluggish unit on the left. Now remember, the template has a +4 modifier for its combat value, so we're going to add that to a roll of the die. So the Ultramarines roll a die and they get a 1. So they add that to the +4, which gives them an attack of 5. Now the sluggers have a defensive value of 4. They don't gain any other bonuses because they're not in any kind of cover, and so that means that the Ultramarines have scored a hit against that sluggish unit, and we flip the token over. But that isn't all, because when you're using the flamer template, there's another thing to remember, and that is that any unit that is affected by the flamer template, that isn't destroyed by it, gets a suppressed marker. So here we can see that unit takes the suppressed marker. Then we move on to the next unit and we repeat the process. We're using the +4 modifier on the flamer template. We add the die, that gives us a 7. So we know the unit under there has a defensive value of 4. It doesn't have any cover, and so it too takes a hit. And it will gain a suppressed marker. Finally, the last unit of sluggers that we're just touching with that template. This time we roll the die and we get a 5. The 5 plus the 4 on the template gives 9. Now 9 is more than twice the defensive value of that sluggers unit, which means that not only do we score one hit, we score a double hit, which means that unit is completely destroyed. And so we don't get to put the suppressed marker down this time because there isn't a unit there to put it on. So when the flamer goes away, we have two slightly grilled units of sluggers, and they both have suppressed markers. Alright, let's look at a second example. So this time, let's see what happens when you try to use the flamer to flame an infantry unit that's on the other side of a vehicle. So regardless of whether the vehicle is a light vehicle or a heavy vehicle, an important rule to remember is that vehicles block flamer templates. So even though the flamer template can reach that unit of sluggers that I've indicated, because the vehicle is in the way, the flames have been blocked by that vehicle and the sluggers unit cannot be targeted. Another example, this time again using the heavy flamer. So we're going to be targeting these two units of sluggers. So I've placed down the template, moving from the center of the heavy flamer unit towards the two units of orcs. So the key thing to note is this symbol, which is a little bit hidden, so I've reproduced it here on the left. So this means that the orcs are in elevated terrain. So the barricades that they're in are raised up from where the ultramarine is. So even though this is a game entirely in 2 dimensions, there's still a 3-dimensional element to some of the terrain. And so those orcs are standing higher than that ultramarine. What it means is that the flamer doesn't reach the farthest orc unit, so it can only hit the orc unit closest to the ultramarines. So the next alternate fire template weapon to look at is the Howitzer. So the Howitzer uses this blast marker. And this blast marker is divided into 4 sections. So on the right hand side we have the A section, and that corresponds to units with this A symbol. So it's an A with an arrow directly pointing out, which indicates that it's a direct fire weapon. Then we move on to the B part of the template, and that uses this symbol. And finally the C part of the template, which uses this symbol. So the symbols all look pretty much the same, they're just A, B or C in slightly different colors. The section at the top can be used by grenades, but we're not going to be talking about that in this section on the Howitzer. So it's just the A, the B and the C that we're interested in. Okay, let's have another example then. So this time, again, we have some orcs, and we have an ultramarine missile launcher. And you'll notice that the missile launcher has this A symbol with the direct arrow pointing out to the side. So the missile launcher unit declares it's going to be using an alternate firing action, and it's going to be targeting those orcs. So in order to use direct fire, you have to have either clear line of sight or obscured line of sight to the target. So in this case, the missile launcher can target any of these 3 interspaces. And remember that an interspace is one of the spaces between the different squares. And so in this case, the best place to target is the one where you can hit both of those units of sluggers. So you take the blast marker and place it down over the top of the target interspace. Then you look on the blast marker to see which section you need to use. So in this case, we need to use the A section because we're using the A weapon on the missile launcher. So now you've identified the section to look at on the blast marker. You then need to use those combat values, the +3, against each one of those units that lies underneath the blast marker. So you resolve those firing actions in the same way as we saw for the Flamethrower. So if you haven't seen that, go back and have a look at how it was done for the Flamethrower. But bear in mind here that you don't place a suppressed marker down like you do when you use the Flamethrower. Okay, let's have a look at a different example. So let's imagine that a Vindicator rolls up and the Vindicator wishes to target these orcs. Now the Vindicator uses the C part of the template, so this is a much more powerful blast. The Vindicator is a vehicle, and infantry units do not block line of sight to vehicles. So in this case, the Vindicator can target any of these interspaces that I've marked. And so, sensibly, the Vindicator is going to target this space, which means it's going to be able to hit all 3 of those orc units. So again, any unit that falls underneath that template, you need to resolve a firing action for, and you use those combat values that are printed in the C part of the template. One thing to note when using the Howitzer is that it doesn't suffer from the 7 square range penalty that you get for normal weapons. So you can fire this across the battlefield a long distance, provided you have, as I said, either clear or obscured line of sight. And remember to take into account any obscured line of sight penalties when you're looking at the combat values on the blast template. Okay, let's move on now and have a look at the next type of fire, and that is indirect fire. So this is the blast marker that we're going to be using for indirect fire. Now it's exactly the same template that we saw for direct fire, but if you're doing indirect fire, then the icon that will be on the unit is slightly different. So here we have the A icon, the B icon, and the C icon. So it looks very similar, except the arrow is now no longer directly pointing, it's rather giving an up and over arrow, which is suggesting indirect fire. Indirect fire weapons can be used against targets that you cannot see. So even if you do not have line of sight to the target, then you can still use indirect fire weapons. But since you're not able to see the target, then there's a chance that your shot may not be quite as accurate as if you're doing direct fire. So the game simulates this inaccuracy by making it so that this blast template can be scattered relative to your target interspace. So if you flip the token over, then this is what it looks like on the back. And there are two key things to look at here. So when you scatter away from your intended target interspace, you will scatter in a certain direction and you will scatter a certain distance. So when you look at this template, the things I have indicated with a circle show you the direction in which you're going to be scattering the template. So you're going to be rolling a die, and that number that you get on the die is going to correspond to the direction in which the template moves. So if you rolled a 1, it's going to move in the direction indicated by the arrow that contains the number 1. For example, if you rolled a 3, it's going to be moving in the opposite direction. And if you rolled a 5 or a 6, then it's not going to scatter at all, and it's going to hit the target interspace that you wanted. The next thing to think about is how far is it going to travel. So we know which way it's going to go, but depending on which type of indirect fire weapon you're using, whether it uses the A, the B, or the C part of the template, then you can see whether it'll either move 2 for the A, 2 for the B, or 3 squares for the C. Okay, so there's quite a bit to think about there, but it'll become a little bit clearer when we see it in action. So here we have an example. At the bottom of the battle grid, we have a Thunderfire cannon, and at the top, we have those 3 units of orcs again. Notice that I've placed a suppressed marker on that Thunderfire cannon, and that'll come into play a little bit later. So the Thunderfire cannon uses the B indirect fire template. So remember, when you're doing indirect fire, you don't need to have line of sight to the target. And in this case, that Thunderfire cannon does not have line of sight to the target because there's a great big barricade in the way. But it can still target the orcs. So the Ultramarine player picks this as their target interspace. And then they place down the blast marker onto this side. And you orientate it so that the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 lie on the horizontal and vertical. The next thing you do is to roll a die to determine whether or not your indirect fire is going to scatter. In this case, the Ultramarines have rolled a 1, which means that the blast template is going to move over to the right-hand side. And remember, we're using the B template, and so we can see the distance there, which tells us it's going to move 2 interspaces to the right. There's the first, and there's the second. So now we can see that that shell has fired up and landed into that ruined building, and will be doing no damage to those units of orcs. Okay, let's change this situation slightly, and this time we're going to add a servo skull gunner into the top corner. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, the servo skull gunner has an ability which we can take advantage of when we are firing indirectly. And I've zoomed in on that symbol here, and that means that the servo skull gunner has the signum ability. So you can imagine the signum as effectively placing a laser dot on the target, and it means that even though you're doing indirect fire, you will be more accurate in where you hit. So there's still the potential for some scatter, but it's reduced. And so provided the unit that has the signum has line of sight to the interspace that you're targeting, then you can make use of that ability to make your firing action more accurate. So in this case, the servo skull gunner does have clear line of sight to the interspace that we want to target, so we place the blast marker down as we did before. This time we roll a 3, which means that the blast template is going to be moving over to the left. So the ability that the signum provides is to reduce the scattering by 1. So normally we'd be scattering by 2 like we saw before, but the signum there means that we only scatter by 1. So it just helps with that accuracy. So this time the blast template only moves across 1 square, and so it's still covering one of those orc units. So it's not quite as good as where it would have been, but it's better than it was before where it completely missed. So we resolve a firing action using the combat values that are on the template, just in the same way that we did for the Howitzer. So one thing it's important to remember is that those combat values will be affected by suppressed markers. So remember that the Thunderfire cannon has a suppressed marker on it. So even though we've rolled a 5, that suppressed marker means that that die roll effectively is reduced by 2. And so in this case, we still managed to hit the orcs, and we managed to do damage to that unit. So a final example in this section is what happens if you actually have line of sight to the target. So I've talked about using the indirect fire weapon when you don't have any line of sight to the target. But when you do have line of sight to the target, then things change. At that point, if you have clear line of sight to the target, the weapon is no longer used as an indirect fire weapon, but becomes a howitzer. In other words, you're just shooting whatever you can see, and since you can see it, you're more likely to hit it. And so you don't have to worry about scattering. So we have the Thunderfire cannon, and it's going to be targeting this interspace. So as you can see from this red line, we have a clear line of sight to the target interspace. And that means we're going to be using this weapon as a howitzer. So this time we place the blast marker down on this side, and we don't have to scatter it. And so once you've placed the blast template down, at that point you resolve it in exactly the same way as you do for the howitzer. The next template weapon we're going to look at is grenades. So grenades are a recruitment option that you add to your recruitment tiles or your support tiles. And when you do that, you get 3 tokens that look something like this. Each grenade token has this symbol on it. So we have the G and we have that indirect fire arrow. So it is an indirect fire weapon, but it behaves in a different way to the way we've seen indirect fire weapons so far. So grenades have a limited range. So unlike indirect fire where you have an unlimited range, grenades have a range of 2 interspaces. Up to now we've used the A, the B and the C parts of the blast marker. But when we're using grenades, we get to use the G part of that blast marker. So on the blast marker, the 3 combat values all have question marks. That's because they're going to take their values from the combat values that are printed on the back of the grenade token. And when you resolve the firing action for a grenade, you use the combat values that are printed on the grenade. So let's see an example of throwing a grenade. So towards the bottom we have an ultramarine tactical unit, and then further up we have 2 units of sluggers. So let's suppose that ultramarine tactical unit has access to some grenades. So it's going to throw those grenades towards the orcs. So remember that the range on a grenade is only 2 interspaces. So let's see whether we have range. So that would be 1 interspace and that would be 2. So that means that we're able to target that interspace, which is going to be hitting both of those orcs. So we then place the blast marker down on the target interspace. So the grenade template has a +2 combat value against the orcs. And remember to add in any modifiers that you may have from cards or ammo tokens, which will improve your firing. So now we've looked at grenades, that's covered the 4 different types of template weapons. So let's move on and have a look at a different type of alternate firing action, and that is the sniper. So here we can see a unit that has the sniper alternate fire action. This is Sergeant Tellian, and this is the icon to denote a sniper. So how does the sniper alternate firing action work? Let's have a look at another example. So let's place Sergeant Tellian on the battlefield, and let's put some sluggers in the top corner. Sergeant Tellian has the sniper ability, and he's going to be targeting that group of sluggers. To use the sniper ability, Sergeant Tellian needs to have clear or obstructed line of sight to the target. When you're using the sniper ability, you don't use the combat values that are printed on the tile. Instead of using those combat values, you should roll on a sniper table. Now, if your recruitment tile has a sniper table printed on it, then you should roll on that table. If it doesn't, then you should refer to the main rulebook that has the default sniper table printed in it. And here I've shown on the left what that sniper table looks like. Currently in Heroes of Black Reach, there are no units with a sniper table printed on their recruitment tile, but in the future there may be. So when Sergeant Tellian is targeting that, he simply rolls one die, so you need to take into account any penalties that are there as a result of obscured terrain. Also, if Sergeant Tellian happened to have a suppressed marker, and I've added one just for this example, then that is going to affect the roll of his die. So Sergeant Tellian rolls a die, and he rolls a 5. So at that point, you need to take into account any modifications. So we need to take into account that suppressed marker, so that 5 becomes a 3. So then we see that a value of 3 means that we place a suppressed marker on the target. So that unit of sluggers gains a suppressed marker. So that brings us to the end of this tutorial, looking at the different types of alternate firing actions. Coming up in the next tutorial, I'll be looking in detail at the different special abilities associated with firing. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.